So Whig history, again, don't worry if this doesn't make sense, but some might have heard of it, or if you do history at university, you will definitely hear about it. It just says, it just sort of people who see the past and history as a progression towards more liberty, more knowledge, more progress, often associated with more democracy as well. Okay, so then those historians will often see an event as, did this help advance justice, liberty, progress, democracy, or did it not? Was it a step forward or a step back? And that's a view that's often really, really criticized as not being a particularly valid view. But it's a view that's still quite common. So this is a really, really famous book, which is sort of arguing that progress does exist. And although things terrible do happen, things are still broadly getting better. And this book by Steven Pinker there specifically argues that violence is massively declining and that we're becoming much more tolerant and much more peaceful and less likely to fight each other. Okay, and what he says is this is a civilizing process over time. So he would say as well that with this civilizing process, we see sort of declines in things like racism. And these are the kind of graphs that he uses. This isn't specifically his graph, but it's the same sort of data he uses in his book, which basically says, well, look, here's World War II, loads and loads and loads, millions and millions and millions of deaths. And then you had similar sort of violent wars, Vietnam, for instance, in the 70s. And then you have things like Afghanistan wars in the 80s, and you had the Gulf War, and then you had Iraq and things like this. But generally, conflicts of all sorts within states, between states, are declining. And then Pinker says that this relates to the fact that we care more about rights and things now, all kinds of rights, animal rights, gay rights, the fundamental value of life. But then there's a sort of problem here, which is that if you look at the number of wars rather than the amount of people dying in them, then you get a really different graph. It looks like actually, if you include conflicts that killed at least 25 people, then there's way more conflicts, okay, over time. So it's, some people here would say, well, actually, fine, there are not as many conflicts between states, but in yellow here, there's lots of civil conflicts within states, lots more small conflicts that are still killing people, even though they're not massive conflicts like World War II. So that is a problem with this kind of progress view. Another really sort of big argument against Steven Pinker's book is that it measures it in rates, not absolute numbers. So for instance, you can see in a graph like this, it's deaths per 100,000. But of course, the population now is much, much, much bigger. So if you have 10 people and 10% of them die, that's one death. If you have 100 people and 5% of them die, so less percentage, 5%, not 10, 5 people die. So 5 times more people die because there's more people. And Pinker looks at deaths per 100,000, and therefore some people say that the rate does not account for the fact that actually even with less percentage of people dying, more people overall are still dying, is one argument. So then we want to think about, how could you do something like that with racism? Because Pinker mostly focuses on violence. But how could you do that with racism? Could you look at how many people are killed for racist reasons, or the total number of racist incidents per population? What could you do?